Today's Bible reading comes from the book of John. John chapter 21 and beginning at verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realise that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said, "Follow me."
Psalm 36 says, "How precious is your steadfast love, O God! All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the rivers of your delight. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light." And so we pray this morning that as I share the word of God from John chapter 21, we might indeed feast on the abundance and drink from the river of delight. Amen. Now, I did have a thought that I'd contact the band earlier in the week and suggest they play "Food, Glorious Food" as the introduction to the sermon. Certainly a very joyous song, those of you who know the musical Oliver. Those who don't, I'm sorry, you should go and listen to it. Very joyful, buoyant song. And it sort of sums up one of the impacts that food has in terms of eating, particularly in company. But I chose not to ask them to do that. But you can probably hear if you know the song, you'll probably hear it in your mind right now, even as I speak. But food is pretty important to life. That's pretty obvious. But it's interesting how in recent years food has become something very significant in the television and entertainment world. Top rating shows like My Kitchen Rules and Celebrity Chef and Master Chef and all that sort of thing. There's even some programs I noticed the other day, more ABC, SBS, where they go to a particular country or a particular region like Provence, and you get a little bit of travelogue as well as the food in that region. And then there are 2 channels free to air dedicated just to food. So it's really become quite amazing how this has just occurred in this last probably decade, if even less. And there is a big link between food and faith in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's special feast days spread liberally through the year, and we heard a bit about that on Good Friday from Evangeline to do with Passover, and we may hear about some of those other feast days in the future. And in addition, of course, in the Old Testament, there was not only those special feast days, but there was the regular offering of sacrifices. And while some of those sacrifices would be burnt to a cinder, most of the food that was presented was then later eaten in company, certainly by the priest, but also by the people who brought it. It was an opportunity to have a meal together with the food that had been sacrificed, a time of joy, of fellowship, and so forth. In the New Testament, there are 35 stories of Jesus and food. 35. That says something about the relevance and significance of food. Now, obviously, the most important one for the season we're in is the Lord's Supper, and I'd have to admit that that's not exactly the most joyful time together. It's a solemn occasion. But in the resurrection account, there are 3 stories to do with food, of which this one today is one. So why is it that food and faith are so often together? What do we learn about the nature of food from science that might give a bit of a gateway understanding? Well, first of all, meals provide the best opportunity to get to know people, providing both time and a relaxed atmosphere to get to know one another. Now, I'm not a scientist or biologist, so those of you who are can correct me a little later, but my understanding is that dopamine and oxytocin are 2 of the happy hormones, and they're naturally released when we eat together, and it actually helps us to be more convivial and more open. And of course, if we're more open, we're more likely to listen to what someone's saying and actually be empathetic, or at least on the side with them. So if there was a controversial issue, I think if someone got up and lectured, we're likely to have more of a negative reaction. But if we're chatting about it in group situation, the nature of the release of those endorphins would probably help us to listen more thoughtfully and positively. A study from the Max Planck Institute for Metabolism Research in Germany suggests that dopamine release in the brain occurs at 2 different times: when the food is first ingested through the mouth, and once again as it reaches the stomach. And of course that suggests that slow eating is more likely to encourage that release than fast eating. And of course that's one of the problems of society over the last few decades. We've increasingly moved away from slow eating to fast eating. And slow eating is more likely to occur in company, fast eating more likely by ourselves, or even if it's with others, it's so rushed we hardly have time to talk. Research from the University of Oxford has revealed that the more often people eat with others, the more likely they are to feel happy and satisfied with their lives. Endorphins, opioids produced naturally by our bodies, and oxytocin are released that stimulate pleasant feelings. According to the world-renowned Mayo Clinic in America, laughter is vital in not only lightening your load mentally, but it also induces physical changes in your body, lungs, heart, muscle. Your intake of oxygen-rich air into your lungs is stimulated, and it also increases the endorphins that are released. The old saying, laughter is the best medicine, is actually true. And laughter, we know, happens more in company and over a meal. If you go to a restaurant and just ignore the people you're sitting with at the restaurant and listen, you'll hear a lot of laughter. So maybe the Bible knew something that the scientists have more recently written reports on. Professor Robin Dunbar of the University of Oxford's Experimental Psychology Department suggests that social eating has an important role in the facilitation of social bonding. We'd call that fellowship. And that communal eating may have evolved as a mechanism for humans to do just that. So, that's where we are with food, and we're in a joyful mode when we meet over a meal, at least mostly. So this morning I want to reflect on the passage we just read, and I want to look at three key things that are part of our living out of our faith. There's fishing and finding, food and relationship, and forgiveness and following. Well, first of all, finding and fishing. The opening verses of the passage, that after these things Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." And they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Now, John in particular is very big on metaphor and on imagery, and this is an example of it. Fishing here links with Jesus' original call to the disciples at the beginning of all the Gospels, to follow him so that they might become fishers of people to build his kingdom on earth. And he engaged with people, most of whom were fishermen. So now the disciples are to fruitfully carry on what Jesus has set in train. And just now on the lake, they will, just as they are now doing on the lake, seeking to fish for fish, I think the suggestion from John here is that they will fish for people, just as he said to them at the beginning of his time with them. So Simon Peter's going on board the boat is significant in the story that continues in around verse 11, where they know it's the Lord and so forth, because we're told that when he gets on the boat and they go out, they find nothing, then they hear the voice throw the net on the other side. We're told that they draw or drag the net to shore behind the boat. And that word for drawing or dragging the net is exactly the same word that Jesus used when he talks in John chapter 12 of drawing or dragging, depending on the context, all people to himself when he's raised up on the cross. So there's a significance here about this fishing and about the drawing of the net. So we have a great use of metaphor and imagery here. Now, often in times of challenge or failure, Jesus speaks in a way that we don't quite realise that it's him. And we see this here in the following verses. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some." So they cast it, and they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. But that opening verse there, they don't recognise Jesus. Now, again, there's practical reasons for that. It's pre-dawn light. There's just enough light to make out the shapes of things. So we know from the reading that they were about 100 metres offshore, so it's not surprising they didn't first recognise it was Jesus. But there's also a sense which that's true for us. It's only as the light increases and as we come closer to the object that we better recognise it. And that's what happens to the disciples. And as I said, John is replete with metaphorical and mystical images. And so here, I'm wondering whether the reference to water and fishing could have an added, what I'd call psychological, mystical meaning. You see, water is a traditional symbol for the subconscious. And it has been night time, just as before they've gone out to fish. And night time is the time for dreaming. So before the light dawns, this is what's happening. And again, light is a very significant recurring motif in John's Gospel. Therefore, here fishing could refer not only to the fishing that I've already mentioned, the fishing for people to become followers of Jesus, but the fishing within oneself for the truth, the fishing within our soul to find the truth who sets free. It's significant that the fish was the first Christian symbol. The first Christian symbol was not a cross, it was a fish. Because the word, as some of you would probably have heard in other sermons or in your own reading, the Greek word for fish is ichthus, and it becomes an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God and Saviour. So there's a sense in which we are called to fish here, to fish for that Jesus who comes to us in the dim light, and the closer he comes and we come to him, and the greater the light, the better the way we recognise him. But having failed to find the fish, we're told in the story, it is Jesus, the light of the world, who helps them find it. And that's true for us in finding Jesus. It requires grace. Sometimes that's something we don't realise. We need help. And what does he do? He challenges them to fish differently. He says to them, cast your nets on the other side, in a different place. And sometimes we need to fish for that freeing truth in a different way or in a different place. And only then do we find Jesus. And to understand the mystical experience, then I can look at my own situation of having to fish in a different place. And you've heard my story, or if you were here at the time, you've heard my story of my crisis of faith, my dark night of the soul. And then in the aftermath of that, I didn't have a framework to understand that mystical experience with Christ on the cross. So I went to Morling College as a part-time student, not to become a pastor, but just simply to learn. And picked up a few bits and pieces, but it didn't really do it for me. I talked to a range of people from my own church, which was a Baptist church, from people who were a bit on the Pentecostal side. Couldn't really get a handle on it until I'd shared my story with a fellow student at Morling College who, like me, had gone through a dark night and had come through the other side. And he said to me, after hearing my story and the fact that I was looking for some way of understanding that experience, and he said to me, you need to have a retreat with the Jesuits. And so my background was certainly not involved with Catholics. And it seemed like a pretty weird thing. A, to be going to a Catholic retreat house. B, that it was a religious order. And C, it was a time of silence. The only time you talked was when you met your spiritual director for up to an hour each day. And it seemed very weird to me. But as it were, I threw my net on that side. And the rest, as they say, is history. Sometimes we're called to move out of our comfort zone in order to fish successfully. And perhaps this morning you might spend a little time meditating on where it is you need to fish, whether you've got your nets in the right spot, whether you can find a better place, and to listen to that still small inner voice that tells you where it's better to fish. And so we see this coming up in verse 7. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." There was recognition. There was recognition at that point when the nets were thrown on the other side. And that special insight that John has at that point is sometimes what we call an aha experience. It's when suddenly the pieces of the jigsaw fall into place, pieces that were all over the place and had no pattern. They fall into place. And those insights, I believe, are when Jesus in his Spirit nourishes us. And it's something signified in the Lord's Supper as well as today's story. It's he who gives them the fish at the beach. And that fish, of course, needs to be assimilated physically in order to nourish the body, but we also need the Spirit of Christ to nourish us spiritually, so that we too might know the truth that sets free in the person of Jesus. And like the disciples, when those moments come, we don't always need to intellectually analyse them to determine, does this Does this make sense? And does it fit a proper theological model? And could there be other explanations about this? No, John just reacts, it's the Lord, and Peter, in his normal and rather humorous way, just throws off his cloak, and we don't know whether he had the ancient version of underpants on or not, so either naked or semi-naked, he just jumps into the water and launches himself to the shore. He doesn't stop to analyse it. There's joy, there's that boisterous enthusiasm, and I think sometimes we need that. But it comes from that aha experience that I think John is talking about here. So an important part of our spiritual discernment on life's journey is learning to be more alert to God's presence, to move closer to Jesus when we sense something drawing our attention, not just in lightning bolt moments, but in the mundane things of everyday life. So that's part of the spiritual discipline, just to be still long enough to notice things. And sometimes they're just pretty ordinary things in our environment. I can recall meditating on my balcony where we're fairly close to National Park, and we sort of got bushland and lots of birds around, beautiful lorikeets and king parrots and kookaburras, etc., etc. And some time back I was just noticing the birds, and then as I just became a little more aware of them, those words from Matthew's Gospel about consider the birds of the air, how your Heavenly Father looks after them. And that was a little aha experience, a little awareness. Jesus was speaking through something very ordinary. So I just encourage you to think about that. And hopefully, Jodie might be able to make her announcement next week about a group that hopefully will be meeting and looking at Henry Newen's book called Discernment, Reading the Signs of Daily Life. That's actually what I'm talking about, reading the signs of daily life. That's part of our spiritual discipline. So there's the food and the fellowship, the breakfast hosted by Jesus on the shore, replete with symbolism. And of course, there would be those who would say, if you look at the words that Jesus uses, he gives the fish and the bread, there's a fairly strong link there to the Lord's Supper and the words that he says there. And there's also a strong link with the words that he said at the feeding of the 5,000. Same elements, fish and bread. And so John is drawing all these strands from the chapters that precede this final chapter. And he's putting together, I think, a whole story. And he's saying that this is about him being the bread of life. The bread of life. So that's finding and fishing, and we've pretty much covered the food issue. But then we sort of come towards the end of the passage in a somewhat more sombre time where Peter and Jesus talk together. And that's what I'm referring to as the forgiveness and the following. You see, at the Last Supper, Peter had put himself forward very boldly, protesting he was ready to follow, and there's the key word, follow Jesus, even to the point of laying down his life. We read about that in chapter 13. But as Jesus predicted, that boldness evaporated into denial when the rubber hit the road, when Jesus was on trial before the Jewish leaders. But it is significant that what occurred when Peter made his denial is there was a fire lit in Greek Anthrakia, chapter 18. And now, beside a similar fire, another Anthrakia, there's Jesus' triple interrogation, matching Peter's triple denial. Again, these symbols, in this case the fires, are not just random. John is a master writer, and so these things are all very deliberately put in. And so, of course, we know that Jesus 3 times asked Peter whether he loves him, to match the 3 times that Peter denied him. But Jesus' interrogation is not harsh. Rather, it's like the skillful surgeon wielding the scalpel to remove the last traces of cancer. healing the cancer of the false self that Peter displayed in his bold claims at the Lord's Supper that he would follow. But notice there's no recrimination by Jesus. There's no mention of failure, not even "I told you so" sort of qualified forgiveness. Why? Because if you look at Luke chapter 22, verses 61 to 62, we read what I think was the forgiveness. That's when Jesus is being taken out of the hall where he was interrogated before the high priests, and he gives Peter a look, a gaze. And I believe that gaze was the gaze that said to Peter, "I forgive you." It had already occurred within a short time of the denials that Peter had made. And finally in this story, I think there's a sense of past failure being wiped away and swallowed up in present love. Now, part of the tension here is Peter's slowness to engage with Jesus' choice of words for love, which is not evident in English, but I'm sure many of you have heard sermons on this before or have read about it, that there are two key words used here. One, agape, for love, and the other, phileo, for love. Now, commentators are divided to some extent on the significance of these two words. They do have a big crossover, and if you want to get a concordance and go through the appropriate use of the words, you'll see that they often mean much the same. But there's I think a sense in which there is an emphasis of one and an emphasis of the other. And I think particularly in this context, the emphasis of agape is about loyalty, about love that really is prepared to commit, a sacrificial love. And the other word for love is a little bit more like our word like, the concept of being a friend, loving a friend. But as I say, the commentators are not in agreement that that's absolutely a clear definition. But I think it's significant here because twice Jesus asks Peter if he agapes him. And twice Peter replies, "I philia you." So if we have that sense of sacrificial love versus liking someone, you can sort of get the feeling of what's happening here. So it suggests that Peter knows what Jesus means when he uses the word, "Peter, do you agape love me?" Because Peter knows he didn't show that sort of love and loyalty after what he promised at the Last Supper. He feels his shame and weakness and inadequacy, and he replies accordingly. He's no longer bold enough to say, "Oh yes, I love you sacrificially." But then in his mercy and gentleness, Jesus relents, and the third time asks only, "Peter, do you phileo love me? In other words, do you like me?" And Peter admits Jesus knows all things, including the state of Peter's mind and heart. And Jesus doesn't push him beyond his ability to commit sincerely. But here's the twist in verse 18. "Very truly I tell you," says Jesus to Peter, "when you were younger you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." Love has to be concrete of this sort, a preparedness to go where Jesus calls, notwithstanding the loss of superficial freedom to choose. That's ultimately, I think, what agape love is about. And that future for Peter, as I reread that, feels real to me. I'm approaching my 69th birthday, so that means 70 years and 10 is getting awfully close. So when he talks about getting old, I'm starting to be aware of mortality. And speaking to somebody else who's roughly in my age group this morning, they were telling me about gardening, and today they're sore and a bit struggling after that. So I have a bit of a feel for what's being said there. And when I visit ABH usually once a month and do a communion service, and you can't help but see people who are a bit like what's just described to Peter. They have no choice where they go. Many of them are in wheelchairs, or they're in those sort of semi-chair bed things. I'm not sure what they're called. And life is pretty tough. It's not easy. And just as an aside, there's one woman down at ABH. Her name's Margie, and I'm sure that Helen will know who I'm talking about. Margie has no family. She's been there for 2 years. She's mentally alert. She can have a very sensible conversation with you, but physically she is totally immobile. And because she's been there that long, of course, most of her friends are dead. The place where she spent most of her life in church, that's not local. So if someone here this morning thinks, I think I could cope with seeing someone perhaps once a month, have a little chat to me later. But Margie's an example of this that Peter's talking about. No choice. But Margie's faith is real, and her commitment to Christ, despite what she's struggling with, is real. And I think that's the irony, that we know the rest of the story for Peter. He ended up fulfilling that. He was jailed when he preached the gospel. He was flogged. And finally we know he also was executed because of his faith. And that's the irony that John is aware of, writing well after the time that Peter would have been executed. John is suggesting that while in words this time Peter said, I can only phileo you, Jesus. I can't commit to a agape love. I'm not going to do what I did before in making an empty promise that dissipated into the dust. But having made the lesser commitment, he actually makes the final agape commitment by his suffering and death for his faith in his Lord and Master. So like he knew Peter, Jesus knows us better than we know ourselves. And he's not going to ask us to commit to something we cannot, but he will challenge us beyond our comfort zone. And he'll help us to fish. Help us to fish for the true self submerged in our souls, in the depths of our beings, out of which we will find the spirit of life, the spirit of the risen Christ who indwells us, and in whose image we have been made and remade. And in finding who we truly are in Jesus, we will be motivated to fish for others, that they too might find the one who is the way, the truth and the life. Finish with the words of Hebrews, chapter 12, 1-3, which refers to joy. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Amen.